Welcome to Comic Tropes. I'm your host, Chris, and I think we're going to have some fun today talking about something unique. We're going to talk about sharks. Well, technically we'll be talking about shark comics, but, you get the idea. Let me explain where I'm coming from here. So, somehow, Palpatine has returned. Somehow, I've been making Comic Tropes for 10 years. So, for my anniversary, I'm considering this my anniversary episode, I'm going to talk about something that I like. Shark comics. Let me explain. I'll give you a little background about myself. I grew up in a small beach town south of Boston, Massachusetts. And on top of that, I saw the movie Jaws at a very young age. I think I was maybe 4. It was airing on network TV.
Tonight, the most exciting movie ever made comes to television.
Anyway, also, I should let you know that sometimes in the summer in my town, fishermen would show off these humongous sharks that they'd caught. And you could walk up and take pictures. These were things that they caught in the harbor. But they were bigger than me. They were usually kind of bloody, so it was scary. It made an impact. Now, as I've gotten to be an adult, I've grown to appreciate sharks and the important role that they play in our ecosystem. But I also have a pretty irrational fear of them. I mean, I love them, but I'm a little afraid. And I think that's the lizard part of my brain that fears the idea of being eaten. It's super unlikely, but it's a scary idea. So I've grown up loving the 1975 film adaptation of Jaws. I also read the Peter Benchley novel at a young age. It's decent, but I've been fascinated by the adaptations as well as the knockoffs of Jaws since I was a kid. So today, I wanted to share with you 4 shark comics that came out in the year or two after the Jaws movie came out, which are from 4 very different countries. We've got the US, we've got the UK, we've got Italy, and even Japan represented. And through that, what I want to do is talk about what social fears the creators in each country were dealing with at that time by taking the same idea, a killer shark, and looking at what elements they each focused on. Let's do it. I'll start by showing you the actual Jaws manga adaptation from 1975. This happens to be a very rare book because it wasn't published by a traditional manga or magazine publisher. The Herald Group was a Japanese business that formed in 1921. They started with theaters, movie theaters, and by the 1950s branched out into importing foreign films to come to Japan. They had a small publishing imprint, Herald Books, that would do adaptations to drum up interest in their movies. And the Jaws manga is an example of that. Technically, this is called Gekiga, which is manga for adults. The term was coined in 1957 by artist Yoshihiro Tatsumi. Japan's earliest manga was aimed at children, but as the form exploded in popularity, comics aimed at more mature readers grew throughout the 60s and the 70s. This one was adapted by writer Akira Chijo with art by Tadashi Sakuma. It's very well done, but there's also not a lot by the creators that I can show you or tell you about, aside from this adaptation. The Jaws manga is a very literal adaptation of the film, with just over 100 pages to the story. If you're not familiar, the bare bones of the story are that a small fictional Massachusetts island named Amity deals with a great white shark. It attacks a woman at night, and the police chief, Brody, has to investigate. The movie goes into how Brody is from New York City, and he moved his family to the island for a simpler life, but he actually can't swim, and he hates the ocean. When an innocent child is attacked and killed at the beach, Brody tries to shut the beaches down. He's blocked by the town mayor, who argues the town's income comes from summer tourism. But eventually, the shark returns, nearly kills Brody's son, and that personal motivation drives Brody to go out into the ocean, with shark hunter Quint and marine biologist Hooper to stop the crazed animal. The manga gives us all these important scenes, but condenses a lot. It doesn't focus much on Brody's family, so some of the motivation is lost. The movie features a famous line when Brody first sees the shark.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
The manga didn't know that it would become such an iconic line, so it adapts it to the much less interesting Chisa Suguri, Kono Funede wa Chisa Suguri, which translates to, it's too small. The ship is too small. The book still includes all the important plot beats, but I'd argue the biggest loss is that it doesn't feature the movie's scene where Brody, Quint, and Hooper bond at night while talking about their scars. It's that scene where Quint reveals why he hates sharks. He was a sailor on the USS Indianapolis, the real-life ship that sank and had hundreds of crew members picked off by sharks. The story of the USS Indianapolis is one of the most tragic in U.S. naval history. It was the heavy cruiser that delivered the atom bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. It was then sunk on the way home by a Japanese U-boat, and because they were on a secret mission, it took 4 days for the survivors to be rescued. People just didn't know for days on end that it was even missing. It's a really important part of the Jaws movie, but since it deals with World War II, and this movie came out just 30 years after we bombed them, you can probably understand why Japan opted to skip that scene in the manga. The characters are easily recognizable, but they aren't based off of the actors. Brody doesn't have glasses, and he's much more standardly heroic, especially compared to the below-average appearance that was described in the books. Quint is grizzled, but doesn't look like Robert Shaw, and Hooper is young and nerdy, but he doesn't have Richard Dreyfuss's beard. Another big difference is that the manga is very grisly. Oh my god, so much gore. It focuses on the absolute carnage of a shark attack, and it shows people suffering more than the movie. It doesn't necessarily build the anticipation of where the shark is hiding underwater and who's in danger. It just has attacks happen almost out of nowhere. Now, in the mid-1970s, Japan was dealing with political extremism and homegrown terrorism. They had events like the Osama Sanso incident that played out for them on live TV. And so horror manga began focusing on extreme violence. It was a way for readers to address their collective fears in a more controlled setting. Violence Jack by Go Nagai and The Drifting Classroom by Kazuo Umez are famous examples around this time. If you can find a copy, and admittedly, I found 2, but it took me 10 years to find the first one, it's pretty fantastic. It really is. It is condensed, of course it is, but then again, Marvel adapted Jaws 2, not Jaws 1, but they adapted Jaws 2 and only gave that story about 46 pages. So it's more than twice as long as that. Jaws 2 isn't as good a movie, but I will say that the Marvel Summer Special that adapted that movie does feature some gorgeous, moody Gene Colan artwork. So that's also a cool shark comic. Let me show you now a shark story from America that came out around this same time, drawn by a master of horror, Richard Corben. In October of 1976, just over a year after the Jaws film debuted, but still in the cultural zeitgeist, Warren Publications published Creepy Issue 83, a horror anthology title. That issue features the story In Deep, with painted art by Corben and written by Bruce Jones. A young married couple is set adrift at sea on page 1 when their yacht goes down. The young woman drowns at night, and her husband tries to do everything he can to protect her body from the elements. Not only do gulls pick away at her, sharks show up and take bites. He fights them off with an oar, but eventually succumbs to exhaustion. The denouement switches to a black and white page where the man has been rescued but is catatonic. Doctors administer muscle relaxers to pry his arms open where he holds what remains of his beloved, only her heart. While this does feature sharks and was popular enough that Warren republished the story in issue 101 with a new cover by Corben focusing on the sharks, The true fear is on losing someone you care about more than yourself. Corben's art emphasizes the vast emptiness of the ocean at first, then shocks us with close-ups of the brutality of what happens to the lady. Again, this actually ties into national fears at the time, if you look close enough. The man's wife is destroyed by nature, but not out of malice. It's just the way of an indifferent world. Now, by the mid-1970s, American culture was already saturated with a sense that systems, political, social, even natural, were no longer reliable. Watergate had stripped away institutional trust. The Vietnam War had done the same for national purpose and moral certainty. Economic stagnation, and I think they called it stagflation, added to a background hum of decline. In horror terms, this produces a shift. The fear is no longer just evil men do evil things, but nothing is actually in control. Let's take a look at a radically different way to interpret this horror when the UK told a shark story around the same time. Hookjaw was created in 1976 for IPC Fleetway's controversial British weekly comic Action, at a time when editor Pat Mills and his team were deliberately pushing more violent, sensational material to compete with American-style comics and rising media panic about youth culture. The strip, scripted under the house name Ken Armstrong and illustrated by artists including Ramon Sola, was part of Action's broader strategy of shock realism stories. They were gritty, aggressive tales that broke from traditional British children's comics. Hookjaw stood out by taking the post-Jaws shark craze and amplifying it to an almost nihilistic survival horror comic story, where the shark was less of a character than an unstoppable force of nature. Action was a weekly comic anthology, but it was canceled by issue 36, less than a full year in. However, the strips have been collected into an amazing collection by Titan Comics that includes unpublished comic strips. The story is absolutely bonkers, and every weekly strip had to feature at least one person getting killed in a unique way by the titular shark. Hookjaw earned his name by getting a harpoon through his lower jaw in his first story, and his dorsal fin gets shot up. So he has visual signifiers every time he shows up. You can tell him apart from other sharks. Most of the comic features a heroic diver named Rick Mason trying to keep people safe. But instead of the shark terrorizing innocent beachgoers, Hookjaw's stories always feature corrupt and villainous people bringing the shark into conflict, and ultimately getting their just desserts. The first story arc features a greedy oil rig owner who forces his employees into dangerous situations. The story moves at a breakneck pace with storms and airplane crashes all occurring near the rig to keep Hookjaw with a fresh batch of victims. The second storyline features Rick taking a new job, working at a lagoon resort for a wealthy developer called Dr. Gelder. Gelder is like the mayor from Jaws multiplied by 100, as he ignores the local islanders and puts employees in danger for entertainment. Now, while there are horrific moments in Hookjaw, the focus is on action. And, like a lot of British entertainment, especially at the time, it's satirical. It creates cartoonishly evil villains that we can't wait to see Hookjaw tear to pieces. Hookjaw isn't a good or noble creature, because he kills everything in sight, but at least he is who he is. It's part of an ecosystem, He's true to himself. He ultimately provides balance by taking out the villains, but he also takes out a lot of innocents, and heroic people do get destroyed along the way. Britain was dealing with fears of institutional failure and incompetence, and pushing back against unchecked capitalism. Hookjaw makes those fears quite literal. Finally, I have a short, somewhat humorous story, a shark horror comic from Italy around this time. Before I mention the short story, however, I will acknowledge that Italy did in fact make an adaptation of Jaws as a comic book. But This book, Squalo Bianco, was unauthorized. So while there is a very literal story adaptation, it's actually also sexed up quite a bit. It was reprinted as part of Spain's Selecciones del Comic Erotico. Italy played fast and loose with copyrights, especially in the 70s. They'd make fake sequels to movies like Dawn of the Dead, for instance. They even made a knockoff Jaws movie called Great White. It follows almost the same story beats. It features a novelist on an island battling the shark instead of a police chief. When his grizzled shark hunter friend gets eaten at the end, and I say eaten lightly because the movie only had a shark head prop and it didn't move. But anyway, the hero realizes that his friend had a bomb on him. What luck!
Damn you!
Universal Studios sued and got the film blocked from theaters. So while that was a quick illegal adaptation, there was also a short story inspired by Jaws, drawn by a master artist. In 1976, the anthology Corriere dei Ragazzi published a 9-page story called Squalo, which means shark. It's illustrated by the masterful comics artist Sergio Topi. It's a fictional account of Jaws author Peter Benchley arguing with folks on a boat that sharks aren't dangerous like he portrayed them in his novel. Benchley suits up for a dive and encounters a shark, but it lunges at him and he's forced to fight back with a harpoon, returning to the ship exhausted. The boat owner had warned him that the sea was dangerous. This story is a quick parable. This short story pokes fun at the media-driven panic of Jaws, but also how its author discounted how deadly a shark could be. Because Peter Benchley kind of felt guilty about how much he made people afraid of sharks. That wasn't really his goal. Italy was dealing with the years of lead. That's what it was called, between the 60s and the 1980s, kind of post or very tail end of Cold War. They were dealing with political extremism and terrorism at home. In 1976, a lot of Italians believed that modern life was shaped by uncontrollable systems of violence and fear. They could be political terror, it could be media panic. And they felt like the authors, the people creating these mechanisms, couldn't fully control that once it was released into society. Anyway, these are some quick examples of how a shared human fear of being eaten or attacked out in nature can also have different interpretations based on the culture and where and when they were created. Aside from the 4 stories that I shared in detail with you, there was the Jaws 2 adaptation by Marvel, and another short but very hard to find manga adaptation of the first movie. Another one. Akira Shonen's December 1975 issue of Monthly Shonen Champion features a 50-page adaptation, so even shorter. Good luck finding that one. Very, very hard to find. The unofficial Italian adaptation is also incredibly rare. And just for completionism, I will mention that Argentina adapted Jaws as well. It was published by Editorial Columba, beginning in their anthology El Tony, but they didn't make it until 1988. It's a very loyal adaptation of the movie with some beautiful artwork by someone credited as Fernandez. Not sure who that is. Argentina has an amazing history with creating some great comics, publishing stuff like Scorpio, El Eternat. But from 1976 through 1983, the country went through a military junta taking control. Their comics at the time tended to focus on sci-fi and period piece adventure instead of horror. Hector Esterheld, the writer of El Eternat, was literally disappeared during this time. So it makes sense that there wasn't interest in a Jaws adaptation until much later. I'll just close out by saying that sharks are an important part of the ocean, and we really don't need to fear them. The odds of being attacked are insanely low, but it's understandable that it can scare us, because every time you step into the water, you're entering you're entering an environment that we can only be guests in. Let me know your favorite shark story in the comments below, and until next week, keep reading comics. See you real soon. Thank you for indulging me while I talked about something that was very fun for me. Just an excuse to talk about, what was for ages and ages my white whale, like looking for this manga. It was a lot of fun to search for it, and I ultimately found it in person in Osaka with the help of a friend that lives there. Really, really fun to read. Goes for an absolute fortune now because it's just really hard to find. Low print run. And I don't have lots of Jaws merchandise, but I do like Jaws a lot. What did I have? I have, if I see something unique for Jaws, I'll pick it up. Like this cup that has a cover as though it was a Marvel cover in the Bronze Age. Or, here's something I really like. There's an artist, a British artist I really like called Staz Johnson, and he once made a print as though there was a Marvel adaptation of the first movie, and he just made a fictional first page of it. And I just think that that's gorgeous. It's a really pretty looking page. Great tone, great atmosphere, great details. So it's not like I have a lot of Jaws stuff, but I do like Jaws a lot. I think it's more or less a perfect movie. Really, really good pacing, really good character work, efficient. I'd love to know if you like shark movies, if you like Jaws, or if there's any others out there that you like. Thanks so much for your support over the years. I want to shout out especially my patrons and my supporters on YouTube, and all of you who've hit subscribe, people that do things like hit like and subscribe, leave comments. That really helps. So thank you all, and why not do 10 more? See ya. And his dorsal, almost got it.